This video is made possible by donations to the United States Lighthouse Society from people like you.
Thank you so much for being here today. Great to see so many familiar names and faces. Thank you all. And this is going to be a really interesting event about one of the most famous, not just one of the most famous women lighthouse keepers, but one of the most famous lighthouse keepers in American history, Ida Lewis. And before I introduce our presenters, I want to introduce Jeff Gales, who probably most of you know, Executive Director of the U.S. Lighthouse Society. Hey, Jeff.
Hi, Jeremy. How you doing?
Good, thank you. As I said, I'll introduce Lenore and Nico, our presenters, in a moment. Just a couple of basic facts about Ida Lewis. And I will ask that everybody, if you could please keep your mics muted, your microphones muted during the presentation. We'll have a chance for Q&A at the end, and we'll allow you to unmute yourselves at that point. And also, only Nico's our presenter Nico Reno is going to be sharing his screen. Nobody else should be trying to share their screen. As I said, this is going to be a very interesting event about Ida Lewis, and just a few facts. First of all, she was born in Newport, Rhode Island, and next Saturday, as some of you heard, we just mentioned, next Saturday, February 25th, is her 181st birthday. Ida Lewis's father, Hosea Lewis, was the first keeper of the light at Lime Rock, and actually the background I'm using behind me is a very old drawing of the Newport waterfront there and Lime Rock light station on the little island there. So her father, Hosea, was the first keeper there. And I'm not going to go into a lot of detail because our presenters are going to do that. But Ida ended up being the keeper for many years. And of course, she saved many lives during her tenure there. She was very famous in her lifetime in the late 1800s. She was really one of the most famous women in America in the late 1800s. But to a large degree, she was forgotten by the general public, except maybe by lighthouse nuts like us, until Lenore Scommel wrote her biography of Ida about 20 years ago. Another book I'll mention that came out around the same time is Women Who Kept the Lights by Candace Clifford and Mary Louise Clifford. It had a chapter on Ida, and of course, Candace Clifford, as many of you know, was the historian for the U.S. Lighthouse Society. I know many of you knew her. I also will mention that I wrote about Ida in my book, The Lighthouses of Rhode Island. It was published in 2006. And around 2014, I was asked to appear in a documentary about Ida Lewis. It was called America's Forgotten Heroine, Ida Lewis, Keeper of the Light, directed by Marion Gagnon. That's when I first met Lenore Scommel, who was really the star of that documentary. Lenore also appeared in episode 48 of my podcast, Lighthearted. And it reminds me, as I often do, I forgot to introduce myself at the beginning for people who don't know me. I'm Jeremy D'Entremont. I'm the historian for the U.S. Lighthouse Society and producer and host of the podcast for the Society, Lighthearted. So Lenore was in episode 48, which I can't believe it was 3 years ago. It was January 2020. So a little over 3 years ago that you were in the podcast, Lenore. And you can still listen to that if you want to look it up through your podcast app or on the U.S. Lighthouse Society news blog. Lenore Scommel is the winner of multiple awards for literature, biography, and humor, with over 30 years of professional writing experience as a journalist, columnist, author, and playwright, and 17 books published. Lenore's book on Ida Lewis, The Lighthouse Keeper's Daughter, was originally published in 2002 but she was just saying it came out late that year. The book tour was really 2003. So for all intents and purposes, this is the 20th anniversary of the book this year. The New York Public Library listed it as a 2003 best book for teens. Although I think it's for everybody, it's certainly not just for teens. And the Oakland Press wrote, quote, fascinating, a lively, fast-moving account to hold the reader's interest, spellbinding, unquote. The book has now been optioned to be adapted into a motion picture to be directed by our other presenter today. Doing today's presentation along with Lenore will be Nico Reno. Nico and I first met 10 years or so ago. Hi, Nico. And he took back then 10 years, maybe slightly more than that, somewhere around there. He took one of my New England Lighthouse tours when I was doing that for a number of years. Nico is an award-winning filmmaker originally from Mystic, Connecticut. His career began as the assistant to actor-director Ben Affleck on the movie The Town, before he transitioned into creative development for Robert Downey Jr. and multiple Academy Award-winning producers. Nico's feature film Hooking Up, a romantic comedy starring Sam Richardson and Brittany Snow, was released in 2020 and is available on Hulu. Nico is currently producing and fundraising for a new short film that will bring attention to the Ida Lewis Film Project, and I'm sure we'll be hearing more about that today. So at this point, I'm going to turn it over to Lenore and Nico for their presentation. Again, I ask that everybody keep their mics muted and don't try to share your screens. And at the end of their presentation, we will do some Q&A. You can post your questions in the chat at any point, or when we get to the Q&A, you can virtually raise your hand. You click on reactions and there's an option to raise your hand, and when we get to that, we'll call on you if you digitally raise your hand, and you can unmute yourself. So we'll get to that after the presentation, but right now let me turn it over to Lenore and Nico. It's all yours.
Thanks, Jeremy. Thanks, and thanks everybody for showing up and wanting to learn more about this amazing woman. Nico and I are so excited about sharing what we know about it, and also the projects that we're working on, especially his film. And the way we're going to sort of coordinate this is, if you think of a sports event, I'll do the play-by-play and Nico's going to do the color. There's a lot of color in Ida's life, and probably not something that she would have wanted for herself, but you know, fate had a different plan. Nico, do you want to open up with the slides? So
let's do it.
Are you? Yeah, and there we go. So as the book suggests, Ida Lewis was a lighthouse keeper's daughter. There were hundreds, as you all know, of lighthouse keepers' daughters at that time. What makes her different? Why did I write a book about her? Why does Nico want to write a film? Why did he write a film about her? Why are we putting all this time and effort into Ida Lewis? Well, the difference between Ida and all the rest of the daughters of lighthouse keepers is that she rescued people. By some estimates, 25 people, but most likely the more we learn about her, it was way more than that. The 25 are the documented cases. She rescued people. She did it well. She did it frequently. She did it with no expectation of celebrity, no expectation of gratitude, quite frankly. In her words, she was just doing her job. And the idea that she would become an overnight sensation, I am so sure never even entered her mind. But that's exactly what happened. And when I say overnight, I really do mean overnight. And she's the type of person that I think if we met her today, at least I know I wouldn't really care for her. I think she was not the type of person that cultivated a brand, that cultivated an image. She was a Yankee. She was a woman who was very pragmatic. She was not someone to suffer fools lightly. She wasn't into small talk. She wasn't into people pleasing. She just did her job. And her job in her mind was as a lighthouse keeper, and rescuing people was just something that she happened to do because we would have done the same thing. She had as much said it in one of her articles. She said anybody would save someone if they saw what I saw. You know, obviously we all beg to differ. This was a woman who was 5'3", 103 pounds. She was slight. She wasn't strong and sturdy. She had a mental fortitude and a steely type of courage that I think you have to be born with. As a young girl, she was, as I say in my book, born to the sea. She loved everything about the sea. She was living in a coastal town. Newport, as you know, is an island that sits off the coast of Rhode Island. At a young age, she was drawn to the sea. She started to learn how to swim. She was a very strong swimmer. Swimming back then was not it was unheard of. People didn't swim. The only people that actually swam were people that had to do it to survive, mariners, sailors, people who would literally die if they fell into the water and didn't know how to swim. Swimming recreationally didn't really become into vogue until the early 1900s. It became a sport in the early 1900s as well. So the idea that this young girl was swimming and competing against boys her age really put her in a different sphere altogether. She also was a very strong young woman. She was an excellent oarswoman at a very young age. Again, uncommon for girls at this time. In our parlance, she would have been a tomboy. And she was very proud of that, by the way. She sort of eschewed anything that was feminine or dainty. She really was all about doing, very active young woman. She was born, as Jeremy said, on February 25th in 1842. She was born on Spring Street. The house that you see here is still there. It is the house that she lived till she was 11 years old. She is one of 4 surviving children. Her older brother, Horatio, predeceased her, leaving her the eldest. Her father, Hosea, had been a mariner and a cutter pilot for the Revenue Cutter Service, which was the predecessor to the Coast Guard. Revenue cutter sailors were known as pretty stalwart guys. They battled pirates and slavers. They patrolled the shoreline. They rescued people. They enforced custom laws. Her father was a tough guy, but unfortunately, he was not in the best of health. He had a bad heart. So he retired. Actually, he had to quit. Retirement wasn't a thing back then, but the government offered him a job as the lighthouse keeper of a newly built light in 1853. And it was in this capacity, and this was just the light. It was literally a short stone tower with a 6th order Fresnel lens and an oil burning lantern. There was no house attached. So he would have to basically row out to the island, which is about 200 yards from the shore. And he would take Ida with him. Her schooling was pretty much over at that point. And this is where she learned all about rowing. She also learned about life saving, about how to rescue people. Her dad taught her that. Showed her how to bring someone over the stern of the boat, how not to capsize the boat, how to maintain her balance. All of these things that would come into play later on were things that Hosea taught her and imparted her, much as he would a son. And she was always treated as the eldest boy. In 1857, the government had completed the house that the Lewises would move into. And it was a small little house that was attached to the light. So they could all live there, presumably very happy. The lighthouses, as you know, were the primary source of navigation for sailors at the time. But the men who were the lighthouse keepers made very little money. Lighthouse keepers' salaries were marginal, $300 to $550 a year. Today's currency, that's about $10,000 to $17,000 annually. They were appointed positions, offered only 2 men. And since they didn't pay well, many of these lighthouse keepers often had other jobs. They were oystermen, they were lobstermen, they were fishermen. They had to supplement their income because they often had families that they had to take care of that lived at the lighthouse with them. The wives, their daughters and sons often took over the lighthouse duties. Sons, when they came of age to get a job and before they were married, would get jobs and would pay into that sort of family fund. So it was really a communal type of existence where they couldn't really live on just that one salary. So when Hosea had a stroke 4 months after moving to that house, it was a huge problem. It rendered him with limited physical capacity. He was unable to fulfill his responsibilities. He really couldn't actually walk very well without a cane. His food had to be cut up for him. He had to be helped in all manners, and that fell on his wife's shoulders. So her responsibilities, which would have been taking care of the light, fell onto Ida as the eldest child. Her mother now had to tend to her father as well as 3 younger children. Ida had to take them back and forth and row them back and forth to shore to go to school. Her mother had to help with the raising of them. Ida had to help with the cooking, the cleaning. It was a lot of responsibility for a 15-year-old girl. And this is her life. This was it. Fairly mundane, hard labor, long days, like many lighthouse keepers. And it would have stayed that way. And we'd be none the wiser if it hadn't been what Nico and I call the famous rescue of 1869. We're going forward 12 years now because this is the event that put Ida on the map. And it happened, as I said, overnight, very, very quickly. The March 29th rescue, Ida was 27 years old. As you see on the map here, Fort Adams sort of sticks out like a peninsula. Lime Rock Light is sort of in the center. And then the wharves that are to my right, that is where all the pubs, the bars, brothels, things like that, that was all in that area. The soldiers from Fort Adams who are on leave would have to walk into town around Brennan's Cove on Thames Street and up in order to enjoy all the pleasantries that happen downtown. Many times they didn't want to have to walk back. They were always sort of looking for a shortcut. And this is where a lot of the problems came in. Fort Adams itself was an active fort. It was the headquarters and the recruit depot for the 15th Infantry Regiment. It could house up to 2,400 people, but at this time, a time of peace after the Civil War, it was probably between 200 and 400. So on March 29th, the rescue on March 29th, it's also important to understand what was happening sort of with the climate at that time. The research I did down in NOAA in DC, there was sort of a period in that 1860s into early 1870s where these late winter, sort of early spring storms hit that area, and it would bring in driving rain, ice, dismal conditions. And that is exactly what was happening. And that's the setup to this rescue. Nico?
Yeah, so specifically what happened that night on March 29th was that Sergeant James Adams and Private John McLaughlin, who were two soldiers who were on leave from Fort Adams, as many soldiers often did, in town, drinking, had a little too much to drink, and like Lenore explained, didn't want to walk the 3 miles back to Fort Adams. So they hired a 14-year-old boy to captain them across the channel instead. A strong winter storm set in when they were already out in the sea, capsizing their boat. The young boy proved to not quite be as strong of a sailor as he had let on. So the boy unfortunately died, and both of the soldiers barely survived, clinging to the hull. As the story goes, Zoraida, Ida's mother, saw the boat from the lantern room, calling to Ida, who fled immediately to the rescue without putting on a coat or shoes. She grabbed a towel on the way out and tied it around her neck, and that was it. History tends to omit the fact that her little brother, Hosea Jr., was also in that boat with her, but Ida really commanded the rescue, getting both soldiers back to the lighthouse. And even though it took her weeks to recover from the illness that she sustained just from being out there in the elements, she still rowed both of the men back to Fort Adams the next morning after they had recovered.
That's our girl. So this was now March 29th, okay, 1869, all right? By July 4th, 4 months later, Ida Lewis was the cause célèbre at the town's 4th of July celebration. 4th of July was a huge deal, especially after the Civil War. Now, we ask ourselves, at least I did at the time, how did this happen? How did this happen that this virtual nobody, this person that nobody would have even paid any attention to, who didn't even live, in Newport, was on this island? How did it get all turned around where the entire town wants to dedicate a day to her, and a very important day, by the way? Well, the actual specifics are that Fort Adams, because obviously it's anything that happens at Fort Adams has to be reported. And those reports would go through the customs collector's office, which in these towns and port towns were very important to the doing business, not just in terms of tariffs and collecting duties, but also as sort of the clearinghouse for federal documents, any type of important paperwork. Everything went through there. Reports were issued, and those reports were made known to the media, well, at the time, newspapers. And in this case, the Newport Mercury would have been the local paper. That would have been, printed in the paper. And because of the wire services at the time, those little reports were telegrammed elsewhere. And in this particular case, New York, where the New York Tribune was the biggest paper at the time, a reporter there saw this little blurb come across about this rescue of 2 burly soldiers by this woman. And he thought, this is compelling, this is unusual, this is odd. So he actually went to Newport and interviewed Ida. That article, that story came out on April 14th, 2 weeks after the rescue. That story went what we would call viral today. It was picked up by national papers. So if I were in Oklahoma Territory, I'd be reading it on the front page. If I were in Boston, Massachusetts, and then it went across the pond to London and to parts of Europe. So everyone's reading this story about this petite little woman saving these people from drowning. Okay, that's one story. So you think to yourself, all right, I can see why people would be interested, but how did that go from being this one article about this interesting woman to this person becoming internationally famous, where everybody all of a sudden wants to know more about her? And I happen to believe that it was sort of a perfect storm of three things that were happening in our country at the time. We're looking at the early era, of Reconstruction. So again, Civil War had ended 4 years prior. The country was ripped apart. The country was in great turmoil. You know, those wounds hadn't healed, and it would take, and some would say they still haven't. But it was a time where the country was really demoralized, looking for a hero, looking for some hope. And they didn't want a hero in the form of a soldier or a general. They already elected one. Okay, Ulysses Grant was president at the time. They were looking for a hero that was a little more basic than that, a hero that they could touch, that had nothing to do with politics or war or partisanship. So this woman comes along, and a woman, okay, an unassuming woman, humble. If you were to read the article, very humble woman, just really believing that she was doing what anyone would do, doing something out of the selflessness of her heart, you know, who could actually, and she could actually pull it off. There was something quite appealing about that. She was the answer to this sort of gaping need that the country had at the time. There was also, this was compounded by the development of the wire services, which, even though they had been around since the late 1830s, they were not really, they didn't come into vogue until the Civil War, because it was sort of newspapers only had their own staffs, they had their own reporters. They didn't want to pay for a wire service that was going to cover something that was happening in another part of the country until the Civil War. Then everyone wanted to know. The immediacy of information was super important, especially if you had loved ones that were fighting in the war. Where the war was going, the battles, all of that. So the desire dramatically increased for news and information. So these stories were getting out fast and furious. Numbers of newspapers had increased. People reading the newspaper had increased. So you're reaching a much larger audience. The third factor, the women's suffrage movement. It was gaining steam. It was gaining political power. It had expanded into other issues, such as abolition, the right of freed Black men to vote, for instance, temperance. You know, they were the major force behind the temperance movement. So they had very much a platform, and specifically in Newport, and I don't think this was a coincidence, in that summer, the National Women's Suffrage Association, they held their conference in August, right after all of this. And I think that was, even though Ida would have nothing to do with the movement, she was not interested in it at all. It's something that I think, just by virtue of the fact that you had this strong, compelling figure right there in your backyard, they were going to ride the wave of that. The summer of 1869, following after the 4th of July, that entire summer, life for Ida Lewis and her entire family changed completely. And we have many, many accounts that were printed in the newspaper. She was everywhere, by the way. She was in every newspaper. She was on the cover of magazines. It was insanity. But I'm going to have Nico, maybe you can tell him a little bit more about what a life in Ida Lewis's life was like back then.
Oh boy, would I love to. This is really, I think, what drew me to Ida's story, is like what happened over the course of this summer. It's really what separates her from every other lighthouse keeper. But as Lenore explained, you know, the 4th of July celebration in 1869 became Ida Lewis Day. There was an event held in her honor where she was presented with a new rowboat, which was like the town's gift to her. And they paraded it through town. About 4,000 people came hoping to hear Ida speak. Ida, of course, was a little too reserved and shy to speak, so she let a few other men speak on her behalf. But the sort of crux stone of the event was that she was presented with this 14-foot-long oak and cedar rowboat that was aptly named Rescue and presented to her. Ida, of course, hated this boat because it was very ornate. It had gold oarlocks. It was very heavy and like very unyieldy and like hard to manage. Least of all during like rescues in the middle of storms. She just thought it was so kind of like unreasonable. This boat was like so unfunctional. So she never liked using it. She only ever really took photos in it. But when she left that July 4th presentation, she figured, all right, I got this boat. I'll keep it moored at the lighthouse. Like at least all that craziness is over. Unfortunately for her, that was just the beginning. Her home for the rest of the summer really became a tourist attraction. I mean, Lime Rock Lighthouse was, and her family were really besieged. Her family, so many people started coming to the island that her family started providing tours for free. They would find guests in bedrooms stealing things from them, promising to return them. The family started receiving countless gifts. Ida received like $100 and a Moroccan red velvet lined case from the Life Saving Benevolent Association of New York. The Rhode Island General Assembly recognized her as a hero of the state. The Cirrhosis Society, which was the first women's club based in New York City, made her an honorary member. Two businessmen from Newport built her a boathouse so that she had a proper place to store rescue. The story that I love to tell is later in life, she actually left rescue out on the rocks and stored her skiff in the boathouse instead. The Astors and the Vanderbilts and all the wealthy elite of Newport came to visit her, but of course, none of them ever invited her to come visit them on shore. She was the subject of paintings and photographs and poetry and songs. At one point, she received an offer to travel with a vaudeville act that was going to pay her $1,500 to join their circus, essentially. Ida was later quoted, it's too colorful a quote, I have to add it. She said, "I am neither a double-headed girl nor a Siamese twin. I will not do it." So she suffered pranksters who were pretending to be drowning so that she would have to come save them. And she also received dozens of marriage proposals over the course of that summer. They had hundreds of visitors in a day. The estimated total, because Hosea would, in his journal, take note of every visitor that showed up and how many there were each day. At the end of that summer, he estimated that 10,000 people had come to Lime Rock Island. And the most notable of those visitors were General Sherman, who wanted to come meet Ida Lewis to know what a female hero looked like. Vice President Schuyler Colfax came in plain clothes because he didn't want Ida to know who she was. He wanted her to meet him without pretense. Of course, once he left the island and her mother told her who she had met with, she became very embarrassed to have met him so informally. Elizabeth Cady Stanton came to try to recruit her to be the face of the women's suffrage movement, especially because they were having that conference in Newport. And of course, President Ulysses S. Grant was given a tour of the island by Ida and her family. He was quoted as having said, "I want to see Ida Lewis and I would get wet up to my armpits in order to see her." In October, just after that summer, journalist George Brewerton published a biography of Ida Lewis, the only one that she authorized. Sorry, Lenore, but you weren't born yet. It recounts her various rescues in her own words, which are really a lot of George Brewerton's very flowery words. The biography is available. Lenore and I both read it. It's pretty remarkable.
Yeah.
And we think that she probably agreed to it because perhaps she was just tired of repeating herself, and it was a little easier to just give people this little biography when they came to the light instead of having to be a tour guide and explain it to everybody all the time. But that's really just like a nutshell of what happened over the course of just those few months after all of this broke.
Yeah, you find more and more out. That Nico and I, we continue to do the research into this, and it's just fascinating that you have to remember that you're trying to do your job. Okay, imagine this happening to you, or you're sitting in your house going about your day, and there's just people streaming in the door, and it's like the whole thing had to be maddening. I mean, they were too polite to just basically say, "Get the H out." So Ida. And thank you for that, because all of that sort of flurry of over that summer, that didn't really go away, by the way. It took a while for people. They never lost interest in the Ida Lewis, just so you know. They were always interested in going to the light unannounced. There were boats that always were booking, these folks to come over. And Nico did mention the Vanderbilts and the Astors, and that's very true, because Ida Lewis really was reduced to a tourist attraction, quite frankly, and which is sort of the sad part of all of this, because here's a woman that didn't want any of this, yet it was visited on her doorstep. It was at this time, too, that Ida was compared to Grace Darling. And for those of you who know who Grace Darling is, she was a young woman who, after convincing her father, saved 9 people from a steamship wreck off of the coast of England, but I believe it was Longstone Lighthouse. She has always been sort of held up as this strong female heroine. And she was the daughter of a lighthouse keeper, just like our Ida. So when this all happened, one of the papers sort of compared her to that. And Ida did feel a kindred spirit with Grace Darling. Above her bed was a picture of Grace Darling's tombstone, of gravesite rather. And on Ida's own tombstone, if you were to see it in Newport, it says, "The Grace Darling of America." Grace Darling was 23 at the time of that rescue. Ida Lewis was, at the time Ida Lewis was 23, she had already conducted 4 rescues of her own, and probably more. But that's what's so interesting, is that the one we were just telling you about in 1869 was her 5th. There were 4 prior to that. And Nico's going to run through the 4 that happened before all of this, before the world figured out who she was.
Yeah, it wasn't until the New York Tribune article, I believe, when they came to sit down and interview her, that it was even revealed that she had rescued all these other people, because none of them were reported. A lot of times the men were too embarrassed to admit that they had been rescued by a woman. That's usually what happened. And then, of course, Ida and her family never really thought it relevant to report it or to get into specifics. They were just doing their job. So Ida's first rescue was on September 4th. She was 16 years old. 4 16-year-old boys, her same age, were horsing around in their small cat boat, and it accidentally capsized. None of them could swim, so Ida took to her skiff and hauled each one of the boys into her boat. Like I mentioned, they were so embarrassed they never spoke of the event after it happened. One of the boys, who grew up to become a man, finally admitted that the rescue even happened when buying an Ida souvenir decades later. And one of the other boys was actually one of her pallbearers at her funeral. Her second rescue was in February of 1866. 3 drunk soldiers stole a small boat instead of, again, walking the road back to Fort Adams. It just so happened to be Ida's brother's boat, Rudd's boat. One of the guys stood up, accidentally shoved his foot through the bottom of the boat. The other 2 either leapt from the vessel or drowned or went AWOL because they were never seen again. Ida, seeing her brother's boat adrift, saved the sinking man and actually pulled out her back, trying to heave him free because he was stuck in the boards. He never returned the clothing or spoke of the rescue, and it took Ida a year to recover from her back injury from that rescue. And the other 2 notable rescues were both around January, February in 1867. The first one was 3 Irish farmhands were transporting a valuable prize-winning sheep that belonged to August Belmont, Newport's wealthy banker. And when the sheep broke away and plunged into the harbor, the 3 farmhands took to the harbor and gave chase, trying to get the sheep back. Again, stealing Rudd's boat that was always moored on Jones Wharf. But they weren't seafaring men, so they capsized. Ida rushed to their aid, and when she saved them, they begged her to retrieve the sheep. And given whose sheep it was, Ida herself was a little worried about, Belmont's anger if she didn't do anything. So she relented, lassoed the rope around the animal's neck, and towed it back to shore. And of course, Ida was never compensated for any of this. And finally, my personal favorite is during a winter nor'easter, Zeradia noticed the top of a boat mast was sort of crashed against a shallow outcropping of rocks between shore and Lime Rock, and a man's head was just above water. It was early morning, the tide was rising, and the man was forced to hold his breath between waves. Ida rode out to the man within minutes. He fell unconscious from hypothermia, having been there all night. And when Ida revived him, he begged to be returned to shore instead of being nursed back to health. And when she obliged, he wandered off, never to be heard from again. And then some weeks later, Ida received a note from the owner of the boat informing her that it had been stolen from him and the man she rescued was its thief. And instead of thanking her, the note said that if she had let the man drown, he would have paid her $50.
That's my favorite story.
Yeah.
And the sheep. So
And the sheep, yeah.
and the sheep. So you can see that there's with most of these stories, alcohol had something to do with it. And you wonder why she was temperate. She never drank. And that makes sense. But Ida's quest for official appointment takes up sort of this second chapter of her life, because in 1872, 2 years after this, her father passed away and her mother took over as keeper, not officially, but her name appears as keeper in the logs. Ida actually was the keeper, by the way, but her mother was getting a little older. There was another rescue in 1877, 5 years after Hosea passed away. And again, it was a rescue of 3 drunk Fort Adams musicians. Sort of same old. But Ida got very sick after that. And this is an important point. She came down with diphtheria, which was a bacterial infection that results in breathing difficulties and heart problems, which we suspect weakened her somewhat. And she was bedridden for months. This, I think, was the catalyst for her concern about, I need to get appointed. I need to have an official appointment. The newspapers, the local papers, were still covering her regularly, almost like, social column. They'd speculate about her future. So it was an indication that she also was concerned. Without the appointment, she technically had no salary and she had no home. She and her mother risked being kicked out if the government decided to appoint a male lighthouse keeper to come in and take over the light. She was very well aware of this. She was 35 years old, but the average life expectancy for women at the time was around 50. So she would have been considered sort of middle-aged. She had to ask herself, how long could she continue to haul grown men twice her size out of the water in these types of conditions? And then there was this, and this would have inevitably will probably be a question that someone's going to ask, was she not married? Back then, as you probably are aware, women had to be married, and that was honestly on the agenda for her as well. They had to be married to be taken care of. Either that, or they'd end up spinsters, and they'd have to become teachers. Inevitably, Ida did get married. She got married in 1870. She was engaged prior to her fame. She was engaged to a fellow who was a yachtsman from Bridgeport, Connecticut, Black Rock area, which is a coastal town. We don't know much about him. It's been very frustrating to sort of patch in those 2 years. We do know that she was back at Lime Rock in 1872 after her father passed away, and she married William Hurd Wilson in 1870. There's an assumption, and I think it's a legitimate one, that she lived with him during that time period. It would have been very odd for her not to live with her husband. It would have been odd for her husband to move out to the lighthouse. That just wasn't done. So she lived with him, but she left him. They separated. They never divorced. She never would speak about it publicly. So there's conjecture. The papers had plenty of it. Was he a drunk? Many of the mariners at the time had drinking issues. Was he abusive? Whatever. At the end of the day, Ida would not talk about it. She kept his last name formally for a couple of years, but after that, she sort of just lopped it off. So it's a part of her life that we don't know very much about, but she had no husband. So here she is, and she's obviously worried about this. So she starts to make some noise. And I'm just going to read a passage from the book because it sort of succinctly adds this up. Throughout the 1870s, whether she realized it or not, Ida had met and subsequently made some very powerful acquaintances that would serve her well. One of them was General Ambrose Everett Burnside, the Civil War general known for making sideburns popular. I think we have a picture of him there. Burnside served as governor of Rhode Island after the war, and in 1874, he was elected to the U.S. Senate. Word of Ida's rescue, the 1877 rescue of the three drunken soldiers, as did her lack of appointment to a position, caught his ear. And then sometime in 1878, he decided to pick up the mantle for Ida, and he inquired among the powers that be why Ida Lewis was not appointed lighthouse keeper of Lime Rock Light. No one could answer his question. Outraged at the slight to this brave woman who had been faithfully discharging her duties without pay or title, the military general started making some noise. And on January 21st of the next year, 1879, Ida finally received the appointment for which she had so long been waiting. She also received a hefty salary increase to $750 a year, making her the highest paid lighthouse keeper in the country at the time, which I'm sure didn't go over well with other lighthouse keepers. And this was just in time too, because her most famous rescue, the rescue that really, when you hear about it, it's really astounding. It also won her the gold life-saving medal first class for her heroism, was to happen 2 years after her appointment. Nico?
Yeah.
It was
So,
1881.
sorry, say again, Lenore. What'd
It
you
was
say?
1881.
Yeah. So on February 4th, 1881, Giuseppe Giannetti and Freddie Tucker, privates stationed at Fort Adams, set out on foot to cross frozen ice that had covered the harbor. They were returning to Fort Adams, of course, had been drinking, of course, tale as old as time at this point. Ida and her mother were in the kitchen when they saw the men crossing the ice and watched them as they fell through. So Ida, again, immediately rushing to their aid without thought for herself, did not put on a coat or outer gear. She ran out of the house and grabbed a clothesline on her way. Her mother fainted. Her younger sister, Hattie, tended to her, and then Hattie shouted to her brother, Rudd, who rushed after to help Ida. Using the clothesline, Ida tried pulling them out, but both of the men were grabbing the line and panicking and tugging the rope, which pulled Ida onto thin, sort of mushy ice. We suspect that she fell through. Imagine her wool dress and Victorian bustle sort of weighing her down. But Ida never let go of that rope. If she had fallen in, I think she was able to get out of the water, and she luckily got one of the men to let go and was able to pull them out one by one. Rudd finally arrived, helping her get both of the men back to the lighthouse, both of whom were nearly unconscious at that point. Both of the men were admitted to Newport Hospital. They remained there for several days before discharge. And then on February 11th, which was 7 days afterwards, that's when Ida was awarded for her heroism with the gold life-saving medal of first class. It's one of the oldest distinctions for bravery created by U.S. Congress. And if I'm not mistaken, it was the first time that it had ever been bestowed upon a woman.
And the reason we know so much about this is the government had to depose. They had to get all these events in order to bestow this honor. Congress required it. And I read that deposition. So it's very specific. And her mother was witness, as well as her sister Hattie, who was her younger sister. So it was that was a major deal for her. As Ida started to age and get into what we call her twilight years, interest in her started to wane. She was still sort of a local figure, but as you can see, the newspaper article, this was in Putnam's magazine, A Half Forgotten Heroine. There was talk as Ida began to age of abolishing Lime Rock Light. With electricity becoming so prevalent, and there was a lot of discussion about reconfiguring the buoying and navigational aids of that harbor. And all of these things started to get into her head. She also was getting older, and there were young clerks now that were running the Lighthouse Bureau. Everything had changed in terms of red tape. There were triplicates required for orders that she had to place, that she would make mistakes, and these were entered into her record. And this was a woman who was very proud and of what she did, and she was very meticulous, and this was devastating to her. This was all she had. And so there were fights that had gone back and forth. You know, we've seen correspondences to such, and even her brother admitted to the newspapers that she was kind of in a funk. She was depressed. So, and even the townspeople sort of, you know, made fun of her. They would go out on the boats, the young boys, and pretend they were drowning and such. And she'd try to go rescue them, but she was older, so she was not treated very well. In 1911, October 21st, she suffered a severe stroke like her father. And the War Department sent a notice to Fort Adams asking them to suspend artillery practice because it was disturbing Ida's recovery. She passed away October 24th at 69 years old. Her brother told the Newport Mercury that was the way poor Ida wanted to leave the light when she left it for good, in a casket. Her funeral was treated much like a state holiday. She was laid in state at the Thames Street Episcopal Methodist Church from 10 to 2, so people could stream by the casket. Over 1,400 people streamed by her casket and came to the funeral. There was a spillover into the streets, 75 yards either way, packed with people who wanted to say goodbye to Ida Lewis. She was well loved in her death. 2 months after her death, there was a movement to change the lighthouse name to the Ida Lewis Lighthouse. That's never been done before. And it actually happened. It was the first time and only time in history that a lighthouse was named after a person that was not a location or a shipwreck or after a shipwreck. But the lighthouse was decommissioned in 1927. And we would probably not know anything about her if it hadn't been for the fact that even though she's been forgotten by our contemporary history books, she's not been forgotten by the U.S. Coast Guard. She's famous in the U.S. Coast Guard. A cutter is named after her. I was able to actually go on that cutter and talk to the folks that were on it. It's home ported in Newport, Rhode Island, and the responsibility for that cutter, named after Ida Lewis, is Long Island Sound, New York, Cape Cod, Massachusetts. She is responsible for 374 aids of navigation. She conducts search and rescue and keeps the ports, waterways, and coastal security, keeps all of that safe, which I think Ida would love. The Training Academy has a building named after her. I spoke there 20 years ago, and they have a massive dedication in their main hallway to her with the famous painting that you saw earlier. The Coast Guard was also commissioned to have her headstone replaced. You can see it, it's in Newport. And it's a beautiful headstone, and they have these wonderful chains that they put around it, because before that, it really wasn't much of anything. She's also the first woman to have a road named after her in Arlington Cemetery. Our goal, Nico and mine, and when he optioned the book, I was absolutely thrilled because I knew that he had the passion, you know, and our goal is to bring Ida Lewis back to the national conscience. And that's really what we want to do, because she was such an amazing human being and was such an unassuming hero. And towards that end, I kind of want to turn it over to you, Nico, talk about a little bit about the movie and some of the work that you've been doing.
Yeah, so thanks to, you know, Lenore, she trusted me, and I, you know, optioned the book from her. And since then, I've written a screenplay based on Lenore's book and based on new research that her and I have done together, and a lot of research that we've sort of been sharing over the years since then. And the screenplay has been officially endorsed by the United States Coast Guard Motion Picture Office. They are very supportive of the project and are willing to help get it made however they can, which is really great to have them as a part of our team. The script is making the rounds in Hollywood and has been for about a year or so now, year or two. Just this actually past week, I had a meeting with an executive that works for Amy Pascal, who's a big producer. She used to run Sony Studios. She produced Greta Gerwig's Little Women and Spielberg's The Post, and little movies like Spider-Man, the past few Spider-Man movies. So the script is being read by the people we need to really get it made and to do justice to the way that I would really like to tell Ida's story. You know, my vision for it is not like a small indie film. I think that she deserves the big screen treatment. She is a forgotten American hero, and I think that her story is very visual and cinematic and compelling. And like Lenore said, our goal is to really bring her back into the national consciousness and awareness. And I think a big movie is the way to do that. And I think we've seen a lot of smaller indie films about lighthouses, and a lot of them don't really make a splash. And the whole reason that I am really passionate about telling a story about Ida is she kind of exemplifies, I think, the life of a lighthouse keeper in many respects. And I think I'm preaching to the choir in this group, but I think most people don't recognize, I think, what the life of a lighthouse keeper was. And we've forgotten about that whole chapter of American history. American in particular is my focus. And I want to remind people of that and sort of bring that back into national consciousness as well. And I think Ida is sort of a perfect example of doing that. And her story is so incredible that it's a commercialized version. It makes the story of lighthouse keeping a bit more commercial. So the script is out there, it's being enjoyed, but there's reluctance from producers to greenlight the movie. Why is that? Period films, specifically, 19th century period films, are very expensive. Nothing about the film is organic, right? You can't just show up to a location and start shooting with like friends. Everything from furniture to props to costumes to carriages, everything is expensive and has to be orchestrated. So it gets very expensive, and historically, period films they're awards films, but they're not box office smashes. So there's a lot of reluctance in which films to greenlight and why and under what circumstances. Right now, you're seeing maybe more period things on TV that have like huge names behind them because those are maybe financially a little bit less of a risk. But in the post-COVID landscape, we've got theatrical that's struggling, and we have studios and streamers that aren't really willing to take those big swings and big risks. So it's a long game that we're playing, and we want to make sure that we find the right producer who's as passionate as us and gets what we're trying to do. And so that's going to take time, and it's going to take pitching it to the right people. And in order to help that process move a little bit more quickly, I think that it's become sort of my burden as the filmmaker to prove to everyone who might have a little bit of reluctance why this film can be commercially viable and how we can do it without necessarily breaking the bank. And so that brings me to the short film project that I have undertaken more recently. I've written a short screenplay that serves as a companion piece to the film about Ida Lewis. It's the same time period, but a slightly different story. It's not about Ida specifically, because I want the film about Ida to just be its own thing. But what I wanted to do with the short film is make a composite character of her and other notable female keepers like Kate Moore, like Abby Burgess, and tell a story that reflects a very common narrative about their roles as keepers. And I want to do this even within sort of the short form, with high production value, with a sort of through a commercial lens, with playful humor, with compelling messaging about feminism, and our kind of never-ending need for progress and change, which is, I think, a lot of what the story of these female keepers encapsulates. I have a pretty successful track record with short films. My last film screened at over 50 film festivals, and we won over 20 awards. So this would be my next one after that. And I'm looking to shoot it hopefully in the fourth quarter of this year. And even though it's a short film, this will also be expensive. So once Lenore and I sort of formally kick off this 20th anniversary book tour, we will be fundraising in part for the short, which will hopefully then do well and bring awareness to helping us get Ida Lewis's film made. That said, if you feel so inspired, we've got a newsletter started where you can keep up to date about news about both the feature and about this short film getting on its feet. And if you would like to contribute, how and when to do that. But as I said, it's all kind of going to coincide with Lenore's book tour that's coming up.
Yeah, that's what we're doing just to kick off, the 21st anniversary of the publication of the book, which I'm really proud of because it does show an ongoing interest in these types of stories, quite frankly. But yeah, we're going to be traveling. Nico's going to join me in July, but officially we're starting in Newport in May at the Newport Historical Society. I'm going to give a talk there and have a Q&A and a lecture. And we're going to be hitting spots all the way up the coastline, in Mystic, in Stonington, back to Newport again, up in Hyannis, Bath, Maine, and then we're going to go back down again and end up on Long Island and Montauk. So we will keep you involved in that if you sign up for the newsletter, so you'll know exactly where we're going to be and when. If you're interested to come or to bring people to come, the lectures are always free. And and as you can see, she's a fascinating woman. So that once we continue to, and if you have any ideas about dates or places that you'd like us to speak or to do the talk, please let me know, because we're open to that. And, and I can bring my own books, or we have a bookstore that will support us. And it would be wonderful to be in your hometown and talk about this, and really keep this passion for this woman alive. Do you have the slide up, Rico, for the newsletter too? There it is. So if you're
newsletter is at the bottom of the screen. It's through my website, so nicoreno.com/Ida Lewis. And we'll just keep you up to date about everything and where Lenore's going to be on the tour. I'm going to be joining her for about a week or two.
July.
Right?
July.
Yeah. Which I'm looking forward to. It's going to be really fun to sort of get together in person.
So thank you all for being so intent and listening to everything we have to say. I hope that you enjoyed it. And if you have any questions, please feel free to ask them. We're here to answer whatever you would like to know.
Yeah, please. About Ida or light keeping or the movies or
film industry.
We've got Jeremy here, so anything we don't know, he'll definitely know.
He'll can answer for it.
Oh, geez, I don't know. Thank you so much, Lenore and Nico. That was fantastic. What a great presentation. Thank you. And I just want to mention that I'm not sure if I'm supposed to say this, but I've been lucky enough to see Nico's screenplay, and I knew it was going to be good. I was not disappointed. It's every bit as good as I knew it would be. And I also want to mention that both the U.S. Lighthouse Society and the American Lighthouse Foundation will be endorsing it. The letters are in the works.
Thank you.
Thank you so much.
Absolutely.
What that means, so that everyone is aware, is that as we continue to send out the screenplay to producers, we're going to include the letter from the Coast Guard, from the Lighthouse Society, from the Lighthouse Foundation, just to really further compel everyone that like this project has a lot of support from the people who know, from the people who matter, folks like you. And hopefully that will galvanize people, like I said, to be willing to sort of take a bit more of that financial risk.
Mm-hmm. So Nico, I don't know if you want to come out of screen sharing at this point. Sure. We can start taking questions. We just did get a question posted in the chat. Laura asks, she says, on an earlier slide, you had an image of Susan B. Anthony, but you specifically mentioned Elizabeth Cady Stanton as visiting Ida. Which was it, or both women? I know I was under the impression that Susan B. Anthony visited.
No, it was
yeah, Lenore and we've delved into this because we wanted to know for sure. On record, it was Elizabeth Cady Stanton who went out there with Thomas Higginson, who spoke on Ida's behalf during the boat presentation.
Right.
They both went out there together for sure. But Susan Anthony's on there because the conference was held in Newport. Anthony would have definitely been involved in that conversation, would have been involved in trying to recruit her. Yep. But she wasn't there physically. That being said, she is in my screenplay. my screenplay, I wrote that it was both of them because I think it's a better story.
Okay. I know I picked it up somewhere that Susan B. Anthony visited and that Ida said that the visit was more stressful than her rescues.
Yeah.
Was that actually said about Stanton's visit?
It was, I think, Stanton's.
I think so. Anthony may have gone out to visit. I haven't read that anywhere yet. Maybe you have, but.
Does anybody else have any questions? And again, I don't see any more questions in the chat right now, but if you want to ask a question verbally, just go to where it says reactions at the bottom of your Zoom controls. And if you click on that, you can select raise hand and we'll see that I'll see that your hand is raised and we can call on you. Somebody's mic is unmuted right now who I think maybe shouldn't be. I think it might be.
I see something in the chat, Jeremy, where Diane is asking about a similarly titled book. As I'm assuming Lighthouse Keeper's Daughter. Is that right?
I'm not seeing that. Did she message you directly? Maybe
No,
I don't see it.
It's on the chat. Oh, it says direct message. Oh, she's asking me about it. It says novel tacked on the end. Yeah, it's I don't know if it's a ripoff of it. There's several books, Lighthouse Keeper's Daughter. There's a children's book as well that is called, you don't own a title, and I actually didn't title it. The publisher titles the books. That's just the thing. I mean, not for Stephen King, but for people like me, you don't have any choice over that. So you go and look, or you have to put like my name after it, and then you'll get the right one.
It happens with movies too, by the way. My film that came out in 2020, they changed the title on me and I had very little say about it and I hate the title. So
yeah.
Oh,
it happens.
A lot of us have experienced things like that.
It's all marketing
I
at
have.
the end of the day. It's like whatever they feel will help sell the book.
Yeah.
Speaking of which, I'm just going to throw the newsletter website that you can sign up here in the chat so that everyone has it and can just copy and paste that and go there.
Okay.
Oh, Kathy Young just asked, the book America's Bravest Woman is about Ida Lewis. Do you think it is accurate? I don't know that book.
I don't know that book. It looks like a kiddie book to me, though. Yeah, it's a kiddie book. A lot of these books, and I stopped doing this because I found that there are children's authors that will take my book and just, use it and write something about it. I used to call them out on it, but it's like, whatever. If the kids are reading about it, it's great. But as I'm looking at this book right now, no, this is not accurate at all. Come on, she wasn't, it's got some crazy stuff. She was running with stampeding herds of horses. I didn't think that was a big thing. And no.
They must have been running in circles around the 2-acre island.
That reminds me of the Believe It or Not illustration. I'm sure you probably both know it, that Ida was featured in the comic strip Believe It or Not, and there's a wild picture, like a comic book style picture of her as like an Amazon woman rescuing somebody. Do you know the illustration I'm talking about?
No.
I might be able to bring it up and share my screen if you
I'm glad I don't.
keep talking, and I'll see if I can find it.
Absolutely.
Well, we have two raised hands. If anyone.
Oh yeah. Tim Leonard, you can go ahead. I think your mic is already unmuted. You can go ahead and ask your question.
Sure. Well, I'm looking forward to seeing one or both of you. I live in Rhode Island and Cranston, so I look forward to seeing you in Newport since it's not too far. And I'm just curious how much new information, because I've read the book. I didn't know there was a movie coming out, so I'm not quite coming out, but hopefully coming out. So I'm super excited about that. And I've got as of yet, unpublished graphic novel script based on Ida Lewis, in which I used Lenore's book from other sources for a lot of the information. So that's a sort of little bit akin to a screenplay. But how much new material? I'm kind of excited to hear about new research, because you were saying some things that I know were not in your book. So I'm just curious how much new material. I will definitely get the new edition. So I'm just curious how much new stuff you uncovered in the time since you wrote the original. I'm hoping that I can make a second edition of it, because, and a lot of it is hinging on Nico's, on the movie, because the way that my publisher works is that if we do have a movie coming out, they will agree to have me do the rewrite. It's not really a rewrite, it's edition, as you said. Well, we've learned a lot of stuff about William Hurd Wilson, more than anybody here wants to hear. A lot of it is mundane as hell, but it's really trying to trace him and figure out exactly what that relationship was. We've met dead ends every single place we've looked, but we are not done with that. There's a couple of pieces of information in my book that are not 100% fleshed out, that I skipped over. A lot is with the women's suffrage movement.
That in and of itself is a much vaster topic, and it's a little more complicated. And I also really just assumed that because she said that after the visit, that she was not interested in it, that was the end of it. I suspect that there's more to it. And that's what I want to sort of do a deep dive into, and how she was sort of used by, if you notice the pictures that Nico had up, and there's plenty more taken by Manchester Brothers, that was a formal photography session that somebody set up. And, and it was in Providence. So there's some information that seems to be missing. It's like, how did that happen? I know that she was asked to go to do talks at different places, and that she refused to. She was not a public speaker. She didn't want to do it, but there's some conflicting information. So at some point, I'm happy to share it with you, but I'd much rather put it in the actual book because it's really sort of fascinating. It's not as cut and dried as it seems. It's like, yes, she became famous overnight, but there was a concerted effort to make that happen, and it wasn't by her.
I was going to say what is unfortunate for biographers, there's no, I think you've mentioned that there's no journals or diaries or letters from her to consult. That's good for a filmmaker because it gives you a little more latitude actually to things that could have happened, conversations that might have occurred are, I think, in play because you don't have, so the deficit of information, I think maybe is bad for the historical writing, maybe not so bad for a fictional take on it. But
I would always rather have more information and then leave it up to me to decide what I fabricate and what liberties I take. I think I would, if there were logs, I would love to read them. But Lenore, I know you went to the National Archives and dug through what they have at one point, did you not?
Oh yeah, I definitely did. And it's the old days. Remember, this is 20 some odd years ago. So none of that was on the internet. So I had to physically go there and plow through boxes and boxes. That's where I learned a little bit about what the weather was like back then and all of that. And because, as you said, since Ida never took to the page, we don't have any real letters that she wrote. She didn't appear to be a woman of letters. There's very little, and the newspapers, as we know, we can take some of that and say, yeah, there's truth here. And then there's a large portion. They were more invested in creating an image of her. So I'm not 100% sure. And now that I have the time, I had 4 months to write the book. I was under a deadline and I devoted my entire life to doing it, but I was limited in my resources. And now that there's more time, I'd love to be able to pick that apart more, and actually have real information as opposed to just relying on tertiary sources, and newspapers.
all right, thanks.
Okay, there's been a couple of questions in the chat. Maybe Nico, you answered one of them, I think.
I answered some of them, yeah, just because they were more about schedule and stuff.
Yeah, Marge, did you respond to Marge Ellenberger? She is hosting the Michigan Lighthouse Festival in Alpena, Michigan, August 4th, 5th, and 6th. And she says, if you have printed material to promote your project, I'd be happy to provide it to attendees. So you might want to stay in contact with her.
Yeah, for sure, Marge. If you want to sign up for the newsletter, it goes right to me, and then we can stay in touch. We do have printed materials. We have digital materials for the book tour, and part of the newsletter also asks if there is anywhere that you think that we should go speak or that Lenore should come speak, and helping us select more dates. So it'd be great to chat.
Yeah, Jackie, I'm going to get to you in just a second. Linda asked, where and when will the book talk be in Newport? Did you already answer that question? Are you going to be, when are you speaking in Newport?
May 11th at the Newport Historical Society at 5:30. It's a Thursday. Mm-hmm. That's when we'll be there, free of charge. We'll be back again. I'll be with Nico. We're going to Rose Light. Hang on a second.
Rose Island. Mm-hmm.
Yeah, I'm sorry, Rose Island.
Actually at Rose Island or somewhere onshore? Actually at Rose Island. Okay.
Yes, actually out there. They have a new general manager or something. So I'd been speaking to him, and that is hang on a second. Rose Light is July 20th at 1 o'clock. And we're trying to couple that with something either at the Ida Lewis Yacht Club or I can't think of the name of the library. I sent a note to them. I can't remember it. Something actually in Newport. We'd like to do 2 events that day. Before that will be on the 17th, will be in Mystic Seaport Museum. July 18th will be at Bank Square Books in Mystic, and July 19th will be at the Stonington Historical Society.
Mhm. We can go to Jackie at this point. Jackie, I think you've already unmuted your mic. If you had a question you'd like to ask.
I do. I'm a
Mhm.
volunteer at the Ponce Inlet Lighthouse in Florida, and I do reenactments of Ida Lewis for libraries and children's groups at
Nice.
schools. And I have read your book at least 5 times. Get as
Thank you.
much information as possible. I find it's very popular. I would love to be able to have you do a simplified version for kids, teenage girls, because they're fascinated, but their reading level isn't quite to your book.
Right.
And I know the Cliffords, who did a considerable amount of writing about women lighthouse keepers, had a teen version that they simplified. They chose just several people. Whether you could ever come out with just a simplified version of your book. I hold your book up when I'm at a library and say, found a lot of information in this book. If you want to read more, be sure to get this book yourselves. But I would love to have something for teenagers, particularly because they're fascinated this was a woman doing all these jobs and how complicated a world she lived in as far as being compared to men. It would really be something useful that we could use to advertise more.
Okay, well, that's good.
Ida.
Okay, thank you for that. I appreciate it. If we, I know the book, I think at least the New York Public Library felt it was of that version was for teens. I didn't know, I didn't actually apply to win that award. It was just bestowed upon. I was so surprised, but I think it's because it's PG. There's nothing really racy in it. But yeah, I could see how it might be sort of laden down with a lot of information that kids aren't all care about.
And I'm very appreciative of having all those background stories to tell. They love this story about the boys and the sheep. Things like that. You can be very dramatic when you're acting it out. So it's lots of fun to do.
Well,
and March is a big month to do it because it's Women's History Month.
That's right. Get on that. But thank you for reenacting her and keeping her spirit alive.
You're
really
welcome.
appreciate that.
So Jackie, I think you probably have a connection to our friend John Mann
at
Ponce Inlet Lighthouse, who I met when I was
encyclopedia of lighthouse information. Yes.
So stop.
There he is in the background.
Yes.
Hi, John.
No, don't stop it. Don't stop it.
I met John when I was down there a couple of years ago and interviewed him for my podcast. So it's great to have you both here.
And we have fun.
Yeah. Speaking of the sheep, let me just quickly share. I'm just going to do this for a couple of seconds. Just going to share my screen and show you the thing I was talking about. Here it is. It's a kind of a lousy copy, but you can see it, right?
Oh my
gosh.
Yeah.
This is the cartoon you were talking about.
It's from Believe It or Not. Remember the strip Believe It or Not that was just there's actually Believe It or Not museums, I think, in various places. So I forget where I originally found this, but I think it's pretty funny.
They really captured her likeness, huh?
Yeah, so that might help with your casting, Nico.
I like the toga.
Maybe what's her name? Gal Gadot for
yes, I know that's for sure. Wonder Woman.
All right.
Wonder Woman. Yep.
So let's see. I think we had somebody pointed out to me that somebody was physically raising her hand. Sonia Selbo, were you trying to ask a question? I don't know where you are. Oh, there you are. If you want to go ahead, if you have a question, go ahead and unmute yourself and you can ask your question.
Yeah. Well, I'm very interested in all of this. Of course, I've been a docent and I've also worked at our museum store. And you're always talking about, where you're going on the East Coast, where our Lighthouse Society office is here on the West Coast, 3,000 miles away. Are you planning anything for this direction?
Well, we're
And
not currently, because I'm based here in Connecticut, but Nico lives out your way. And
I guess I could show up somewhere and do
Yeah.
the talk, and Lenore can zoom in for once.
yeah, I mean, I'm happy. Yeah, Nico could do the talk out in the West Coast. He's in LA. Are you in LA? Where are you?
I'm in
I
Los
mean,
Angeles. Yeah,
yeah.
we actually hadn't thought about that. So that's definitely something that we could consider doing if
Sure.
there's interest. I think we would need to garner some interest, which is part of what we've started the newsletter for, is just to see who's interested, who might want us to come speak and where. That, you know, we're trying to like build a bit of a community around this book tour and about the films. So the more we could sort of connect that way, I would love to. You know, I'm in California, so there's plenty of lighthouses that I haven't gotten to yet on this coast in my own backyard. So
Sure.
I would love to do that if there is enough
Well,
interest.
well, we have a nice one up here. Point No Point has got smushed a little by that king tide that we had recently. But they're working on restoring the grounds and stuff, but it would sure be nice. Also, where exactly, well, I wrote down where I think the books are available.
Mhm.
Because I would sure like to get a copy. And we have a museum store. I don't know, Jeff, will we be open this year yet? The museum store?
Probably not, but we can offer, we can recommend, people can order this on Amazon, right, Lenore?
Yeah, I prefer them to use the publisher site, which is Roman and Littlefield, if it's possible. You can get it at Barnes, you can get it anywhere, quite frankly. You'd have to order it physically or online. But
Okay.
publisher is Roman and Littlefield, and it is available on Amazon as well. But
Jeremy,
I don't care to deal with Amazon, but.
me either. So
Okay, so the publisher is who now?
It's on the
Roman.
screen there. It's
Roman and Littlefield,
Yeah.
ROWMAN.
we can also put it in the chat for you. I'll just
Yeah.
Okay, yeah,
Yeah.
please do that.
It has its own page. You can order directly. And if you need to order, like if, for instance, you had a bookstore or a gift shop or whatever, there's a link where you can get 50% off, and, you know, just like anything else, they'll just ship them to you and you can sell them for whatever.
Great, okay.
If
Thank
you
you.
ever wanted to do a tour up the West Coast, Nico, we could arrange talks for you in San Francisco and Portland and Seattle, so we could help you with that.
Okay, cool. Yeah, let's chat about it for sure.
Yes.
Let's see when we might be able to do that. Probably would probably be for me would be around like in August. But I know Lenore also has some East Coast stuff, so we just have to coordinate. But let's figure that out.
Yeah, I'd love it. That'd be
Sounds
great.
like a nice trip.
Yeah.
Let's see, did you answer Nancy's question about where is the list of dates?
We're going to send it out with the newsletter. Right now it's
Mm-hmm.
incomplete, so I could give you them, but we don't have times for a bunch of the events. Well, as you know, some of these places are closed and they're manned by volunteers, so
Yeah.
we've got commitments, but we don't have specific times. So if people can be patient, if you can sign up for the newsletter, I will send those along as soon as I have that information. We're working on it now.
Mhm.
So, I mean, we have like 10 places, but as I said, it's useless unless you have a time and an actual date.
Yeah, I know we're working on possibility of you speaking somewhere in the Portsmouth, New Hampshire area where I am, maybe Kittery, Maine, just across the river, but somewhere in this area. I hope we can
Yeah.
do that. Linda Kramer has a question, I think, has her hand virtually
Yeah.
raised. So Linda, if you want to go ahead.
I just wanted to say that I'm in Seattle and there are groups of libraries around here and we all love listening to authors. So if you want to come to Seattle, you'll get a big welcome.
I did this tour in Seattle, by the way, that when I
Did
first,
you?
yeah, I hit a bunch of stores out there. Unfortunately, it was the one day in Seattle where it was sunny. Didn't have the best turnout because they said, you know, normally when, you know, it's raining, everyone wants to. So I was like, dang, I come on the one day where it's sunshine. But
Well,
yes,
don't forget the libraries.
I shan't. Libraries are one of my favorite places to speak.
They're wonderful here.
Yeah, well, they're great resources in general.
Yep.
Okay.
All right, so let me see if there's, I don't see any other hands raised. And I don't see any, unless I'm missing something, I don't see it.
Marge Ellenberger is physically raising her hand.
What's that?
Marge Ellenberger is physically raising her hand. Go ahead and unmute yourself, Marge.
Yeah. Just click on the, there you go.
Yeah. I want to make the Michigan Lighthouse Festival available to both Lenora and Nico, and anything I can do to help you out in your project. I will put my email address in the chat, and you can email me if you have a short film. I'll fit it in Friday night at the meet and greet to do a little promotion for you. Anything I can do to help you out, let me know.
Thank you. That's so kind.
That is wonderful. We really appreciate that. Thank you so much. When is that festival again? It's in early August, right?
August 4, 5, and 6.
Okay.
Okay,
That's,
gotcha.
August 7th is National Lighthouse Day. So what wouldn't you know?
Yeah.
Yeah. It's important to remember that there's not just lighthouse nuts on the East Coast and the West Coast, but in the middle of the country too. In fact, I think most people here know the answer to the question, what state has the most lighthouses? Of course, it's Michigan.
Yep.
Everybody knows that, right?
And if Lenore and Nico, you'd like the Michigan Lighthouse Guide, I'll be happy to send you a map of all 129 lighthouses.
Yeah, we'd like to do those in August. We'll do 4 a day.
Yeah. It'll just take you a month or so.
Yeah.
Thank you so much. That's very kind of you.
Yeah, thank you,
I'm
Marge.
happy to help out any way I can.
Oh, you're a doll. We knew this was a great audience because you guys have, you love lighthouses and you understand the importance of them. And so many times I think they're so romanticized by the general public. They don't really get it, or they don't really understand the lives of the people that actually were the keepers there. And when so that's how come with Ida, it's like the perfect person because she's not some obscure person. This is somebody that actually was in, the limelight for all those years.
Yeah. I do want to mention that this is being recorded and it will be posted on the U.S. Lighthouse Society YouTube channel and on the website within the next few days, probably on Monday. So if you miss part of it or you want to relive it or tell your friends about it, watch for that. It will be posted soon. And also, I'm just checking again. I don't see any more questions at the moment. I see a lot of nice comments in the chat. People have enjoyed this.
Yeah, thank you.
So I do want to mention before we sign off that Jeff and I will be hosting another Zoom event, would be our 3rd in 4 weeks, and another one next Saturday, the 25th at 4 p.m., same time as this one, 4 p.m. Eastern time. It'll be a preview of the Long Island, New York tour that I will be leading in May, be May 13th to 20th. Mostly on Long Island, a little bit of Manhattan and Staten Island. The National Lighthouse Museum is part of it. There are spaces available on that tour. Go to uslhs.org to learn more, and also check out the notice of that event will be going out very, very soon. Again, next Saturday at the same time as this one. There are other tours coming up as well. Check out the website for those. Jeff, I don't know if there's anything you want to add about that. Or not.
Yep, just take a look at the website, and thanks everybody for coming to this. And I think Ida Lewis is a great subject. I mean, she is the Grace Darling of America. If everybody doesn't know who Grace Darling is, you should read about her also in Great Britain. Yeah.
Can I just say one more thing? I wanted to wish Nico a happy birthday. His birthday is tomorrow. Like Ida Lewis, he's 181. And he has a new Ida, so but it is his birthday and he dedicated the weekend to be here with us. So happy birthday, Nico.
Thank you.
Very well preserved for 181.
Yeah, he looks good.
Yeah. I'm young in heart, old in spirit.
That's right.
Yeah, happy birthday. Happy birthday to you and Ida. So I just wanted to say a little something about Ida that I was thinking about before we started here. She obviously was a great lighthouse keeper. She was an inspirational person. Still inspires us, but she's also representative of lighthouse keepers everywhere. Women lighthouse keepers in general, in this country and around the world. Lighthouse keepers were a special breed. Never saw themselves as heroes. You pretty much said that as well. They were just doing their job through storms and all kinds of adversity. But I believe they were heroes, very important to the growth of our country. It's important that we remember these people. So I just want to thank Lenore and Nico again for continuing to preserve the memory of Ida Lewis through writing and filmmaking. And I think it's so important. So again, thank you all for attending today. We really appreciate it. We hope to see you again next week and in future events. And thank you and take care. Bye,
Thank you.
everybody.
Thank you, guys. Thank you.
Yeah.